So there are cultural consequences to pluralism. But there have been political consequences to pluralism as well. I want to talk about three court cases that have been very important for the relationship of Christianity to public power in the United States. In 1961, the Supreme Court heard the case Torcaso v. Watkins. It had to do with the issue of notary publics in the state of Maryland. Notary publics, if you don't know what a notary is, sometimes you have to have your signature verified on a document. And so going to a notary is empowered by the government to affirm that this person is who they say they are. Right? I've seen their ID, or I know them personally, and so I'm affixing this seal or stamp to it. Well, as part of being a notary in Maryland in the 1960s, you had to declare a belief in God. Right? That was a part of what it meant to fulfill all your requirements to be a notary. Well, there are certainly atheists in the United States in the 1960s, but there are people who are religious in the 1960s who don't believe in God. For example, Buddhists. Right? There are some forms of Buddhism that have the notion of deities and gods, but there are some forms of Buddhism that are essentially atheistic. Taoism would be another example of a religion that, God isn't that important. There really isn't a notion of God. And so those people would have been excluded by a religious test from serving in a governmental office, which of course is prohibited by a variety of things. And ultimately the Supreme Court decided that this violated the First Amendment. Other decisions over the next several years by the Supreme Court continued to talk about this idea of, does freedom of religion mean you can have freedom from religion? With ultimately deciding that yes, freedom of religion means you can be free of religion. Another very important case kind of came off of that as well, and will be Battalion. So in New York, the regents of the state of New York, in the State Board of Education, had crafted what they considered to be a non-denominational prayer that was to be said in New York public schools each day. And we're talking about a time where prayer was publicly said in schools. And so the regents of the board said, well, let's create a prayer that will be something that people of a variety of faiths could pray, right? It's very general, but it's still prayer. Religion's still important. And ultimately they argued that it was part of the moral and spiritual education of students. Ultimately, though, the Supreme Court decided that this could possibly end up as religious persecution if a particular individual didn't want to say that prayer. They could end up being persecuted. So it essentially got rid of prayer in public schools. The last case to mention, there have been others, and there are a wide variety of First Amendment cases we could talk about. But Abingdon Township v. Schempp. So prayer in public schools was addressed with in the Engel case. In the Abingdon Township case, or the Schempp case, it involved the reading of the Bible. In Abingdon Township, the practice was to read the Bible without comment. Right? You just read a passage from the Bible. And again, the township was viewing this as a non-sectarian activity. Right? And so if you had a Catholic teacher, they wouldn't then describe or comment on the reading from a Catholic perspective, or if a Protestant teacher, a Jewish teacher, you were just reading from the Bible. Now, Bible reading had been an important part of public schooling since it had begun in the United States. And it too was looked upon as moral training. And this idea of, part of public education is not just to, provide them knowledge and skills academically, but was to train and help people to have character. But the school district also allowed people to opt out. Right? So if you as a parent were an atheist and you did not want your children to hear a Bible reading, right, even without comment, you felt, right, you're trying to push your beliefs on me, so the township said you can opt out of that practice. Multiple translations were used, right, from a variety of translations because there are slight differences between Protestant translations, Catholic translations, and of course Jewish translations. A simple example is of the differences in the Ten Commandments. Right? Jews have a different list than Protestants, who have a different list than Catholics. And so there's the desire not to privilege Protestantism over Catholicism, Christianity, or Judaism. But some parents were worried that if their children opted out, that those children would be branded atheists, right, which would lead to a variety of problems. And then, of course, atheists themselves had problems with practice. Ultimately, the court ruled that by providing the exemption, by providing the opt-out, the school district recognized that it was a religious exercise and not just a neutral moral exercise, so it was a First Amendment issue, and so it was an establishment of religion, which is why they then ruled that it was unconstitutional. Now, if they had not offered the opt-out, how would the court have decided? We don't know. The trajectory of the court at the time probably still would have ruled it unconstitutional, but the township kind of essentially spoiled themselves with that. I think Engel was in 63 and the Shemp case was 65, so these are all kind of in the 60s. There would be later First Amendment cases up through the 70s and even, of course, recent times. But what we're seeing here is this recognition of pluralism, that there is a diversity of faiths, and so public governmental supported institutions have to be very careful to not establish religion, at least looking from the standpoint of the Supreme Court. Questions, comments about pluralism or any of the cases that we've talked about? Another rather interesting aspect of culture and society in the late 20th century was the developing environmental concern. In March of 1967, Science magazine published an article by a historian named Lynn White. And White's article was entitled "The Historical Roots of the Ecological Crisis." In the late 60s and into the 70s, a lot of people began to be very concerned about the impact humans were having on the environment. Especially concerning was the development of nuclear power, and then how that power and the water that was used for the cooling of the reactors. There was also a concern about the impact that industry and companies were having as they would get rid of chemicals. They would, and those that would be polluting water streams that were nearby. Right? So there's all this environmental concern, this environmental consciousness. And so White's article comes in the context of trying to, as a historian, explain how have we gotten to this point? Why is it that we seem as a culture or as the Western world, why do we seem to be unconcerned about our impact on the environment? Ultimately, White argued that the ecological problems that were being faced in the 60s were due to Christian conceptions of the environment. Christians, especially since the time of Francis Bacon, argued White, looked at the creation account, looked at Genesis chapter 1, and saw there that humans were to have dominion over the earth. And so they looked at that, argued White, as a carte blanche proviso, free reign to treat the environment however they would like. So this attitude of, we're in charge of the environment, we can do whatever we want to the environment, combined with developing technologies, had caused Westerners to ignore the consequences of their activities on the environment. So Western Christianity, White argued, was part of the reason why we were having so many environmental problems. But even within Christianity, argued White, there were some trends that could change this mindset. He particularly pointed to the views of Francis of Assisi, who looked at nature, saw all creation as brothers and sisters, that were companions with the earth around us, that God's divinity was present in all aspects of creation. And White said here was a trend within Christianity that could help change those attitudes.
What exactly did he say about Francis of Assisi?
That essentially his views about the relationships that human beings could have with the environment. So the animals are our brothers and sisters. God's presence in nature. All of those things would present a different view of nature. A lot of environmentalists, however, really kind of took this up and said, right, Christianity is the problem. That's the way that should be, or that's the way that it brought about this, or that's what brought about this problem. And so they believed that religious solutions were not going to have the impact on environmental concerns. And so they looked to non-Christian traditions like Buddhism, Native American traditions, and said Christianity is not going to help us solve it. And so we'll look at some of these non-Christian religions to address this ecological crisis. Now, one of the classic expressions of this was a commercial from the 1970s of, there's this convertible traveling down high speeds down this road, and the people inside start throwing their trash out, right? Non-concerned, having fun, throw their trash out. And you see this trash just littered all over the road, and the camera catches at the edge of this trash is somebody in Native American garb, and the camera pans up slowly, and there is a tear coming out of his eye. Right? You can find this on YouTube. This Native American environmental commercial or something like that. Probably bring it in. The irony, of course, is the actor wasn't even Native American. But the idea being presented here is that we are destroying the Native American land, and the Native Americans have this great pristine, view of nature, and there's something that we should turn to of that would, change the situation.
So they thought that we were like harming the environment because we changed the narrative and tried to
that's part of it, but just that there was this attitude from Genesis 1 of where God says, have dominion over the earth. And so that this mindset of we can do whatever we want to the environment because God gave us control. Other Christians, however, said, no, that's not the Christian viewpoint. And they wouldn't deny that some people as Christians have had that viewpoint, but would have said, when you look at Scripture, the Bible doesn't really teach dominion like a lot of people are practicing it, but instead we're teaching stewardship. Right? That we have stewardship of creation. We should be very careful in how we take care of it. And so there were many Christians who took this idea of stewardship and were very active in environmental concerns. Now, this divide still continues even today. Often, a lot of it split along political lines, where those Christians who tend to support limited government might tend to support limited regulations on the environment. But essentially, there's this question of, as Christians, what is our responsibility to the environment, to the created world around us? And there's so many other things wrapped up with this today. The politics of, if we accept that humans are affecting climate change. That's not just It's not just a scientific issue. And there's a political component of that as well. And there are religious components to that additionally.